Today, we're going to try to break down flexibility.
Paid up, and we want to think about creating space.
Probably sit, swing the leg around. Do this little foot, and we think of a bunion having a little kick, right? It is a multifactorial thing to break down, so I'll do my best to make it as simple as I can. When we think about flexibility, we think about somebody that may be trying to touch their toes, and when we think about something like that, we think about the components involved, and the basics of those components would be muscle, tendon, and ligament. When we talk about muscle and its role that it plays in being flexible or not so flexible, what we really have to break down is the role of the alpha motor neuron and the gamma motor neuron. So the alpha motor neuron, best way to think of what it's doing in terms of flexibility, is it sets the tone of muscle, the resting state of muscle, right? And via tone, it also is responsible for contraction, right? So this is a lower motor neuron. Alpha motor, think contraction. The way the alpha motor neuron knows when to contract and how fast and how often and how much is based off of something called the muscle spindle, which is relegated or regulated by the gamma motor neuron. The gamma motor neuron is the thing we really want to talk about when we're talking about muscles and how they pertain to flexibility, because gamma motor neuron gain, if you're maybe a podcast nerd, you may know gain and volume kind of go hand in hand. But having our gamma motor neuron volume cranked up or cranked down is what's going to somewhat create the presentation of being flexible or not. And let's break that out a little bit more. So let's say I have a little higher gamma motor neuron gain. Well, I'm going to have a higher resting tone because the sensitivity of the spindle is jacked up, which is going to tell the alpha motor neuron to create more tone at rest, but also contract faster. This could be good for certain kinds of athletes, right? Sprinters, explosive types of athletes. Or if I have a lower gain or volume on that gamma motor neuron, I'm going to be more flexible. All of this is based off of, at least research has shown, serotonin. So the levels of serotonin that are available at the time of contraction is what's going to make the gamma motor neuron decrease or increase its volume. And studies where they've done knockout mice where they had no serotonin available to the gamma motor neuron, what we saw was hugely increased excitability of the alpha motor neurons. We saw a lot of contraction. So just think about this in general terms. If somebody is a little more stressed, right? We think of serotonin as one of our feel-good neurotransmitters. Somebody's a little more stressed, or say we have some gut issues, we may see what? A tense person. So these things that we think of as euphemisms, right? I'm very tight and I'm anxious really are when we start to break down the physiology and the biology behind that. One other thing we want to talk about is how do we test for gamma motor neuron gain or volume? Believe it or not, it's an elbow flexion test. So we're seeing the smoothness of this as I do it as a practitioner, not them doing it themselves. So this is passive. And then also, where do we hit in range? If somebody isn't even getting into full elbow extension, or there's kind of a spasticity or rigidity to it, also, are they going into hyperextension? So talking about hyperextension of a joint, let's move into tendons. So tendons are the next component. Obviously we know tendon is what connects a muscle to a bone. Tendons are collagen for the most part, and there are around 16 types of collagen. Really, when you get into subtypes, it's more around 50-ish. So one of the big things that's going to determine my end-range flexibility around joints is my collagen status and the dominance of certain types of collagens and proteoglycans. And some of that can be messed with via genetic SNPs, and that's where we're going to see somebody maybe be a little more flexible just based off how they're made, right? And we know that's a fact. But the other thing is what did we do in these formative years of development? What were the loading strategies that took place? So Keith Barr is a researcher that used to work for NASA and now does exclusively tendon research, and he has some really good videos out there that explain tendon pliability and how we load tendons very well. What I'm going to break down is, if I have a very stiff tendon, the way that I would get that tendon to be more pliable or increase length is I would go slow and low, right? I would load that tendon up very heavily, go through full range of motion very slow. That's going to make that tendon undergo hysteresis or creep, which is what happens, say, for example, if I sit in a wall sit, The reason that your quad is burning is because your patellar tendon is constantly stretching, you're undergoing creep, and your quad is constantly having contract. So it's not really an isometric contraction. That quad is always trying to shorten against the creep of that patellar tendon. Hence why it burns so much, not just the buildup of lactate or lactic acid as we've been told in the past. So then the opposite of that would be if I wanted to stiffen up somebody's tendon, I wouldn't load it heavily and slow. I would want to be loading that very explosive through a mid-range of motion, something like box jumps, jump rope, plyometrics. So that's where we want to take into account, okay, so far we've covered muscle. What is the athlete, the patient in front of me's volume of the gamma motor neuron, right? We can do an elbow flexion test, taking some other factors into account. Then we can look at their tendon structure, right? What kind of athlete are they? What's their end range look like just based off of that tendon? And then we have to take into account ligaments, right? Ligaments would connect bone to bone. And an easy way to, this isn't testing specifically for ligamentous laxity, but the Baton scale of hypermobility is going to help us determine what is their passive end range of motion, and then we collect 9 different data points and we determine, man, they're more on that hypermobile profile, or they're just normal, or they're hypomobile. And that's an easy test. I have another video out there on the Baton hypermobility score. Interesting note on ligaments, they start to tear or lose in integrity at around 6% of norm. That's not a lot. So what is our system relying on to create contraction, stretch, resilience, power? Muscle and tendon. Ligaments are what? To basically hold the bones in a position and use these other things as active dynamic stabilizers versus passive stabilizers. And you can bet your butt you're going to run into problems as far as injury and pain go if we start using passive structures, ligament and bone, as our stabilizing features. To wrap this all up, I want to talk about maybe a different way to think about increasing flexibility, right? Instead of just saying, okay, so let's say we have somebody with increased gamma motor neuron gain or volume, which is going to cause alpha motor neuron increased resting tone. Maybe they're a little stiffer through their tendons and a little stiffer through their ligaments. What do we want to do with this person? Well, we know one thing, our loading strategies are a big part of this. Increasing our levels of serotonin and other hormones and neurotransmitters that can help relax the system. But let's get a little more specific. So turning down the volume in this gamma motor neuron is a big deal when it comes to resting tone or my passive flexibility. Like, I just got off the couch and this is what I look like. And believe it or not, all of this is coordinated within your brainstem in a particular area called the reticular area of your brainstem. And the best way to do this is through rhythmic breathing, peripheral gaze, and balance. So why is that the case? Rhythmic breathing taps into that reticular formation and starts to calm down the volume of that gamma motor neuron. Same thing with peripheral gaze. Huberman, I believe it's Eric Huberman out of Stanford, has done quite a bit of research on human vision and relaxation effects. And when we tend to look at a horizon or a panorama scenery, the human brain tends to chill out a little bit. And we can imagine how that's going to have cascading effects. And balance. So if my balance is, I would say, adequate or above adequate, right? And I can stand on one leg, close my eyes, and I have good integration from my inner ear, my visual input system, and then my proprioceptive feedback, it makes sense that I'm not going to have to work as hard through my alpha motor neuron to create contraction to stabilize, which is the big deal. And an interesting side note on all this is the same areas where all of these things are conglomerated in your brainstem is also the same area where the descending inhibitory pathway or your kind of pain relief area and your habituation areas are basically put together in your brainstem, or that's where they're all congregating. Why does this matter? Well, if I'm going to have somebody work on flexibility or rehab drills, it may be a good idea to work on the position they're not so great at while integrating breathing, vision, and balance. But at the same time, I could be reducing pain, and I need to do that in a way that forms habits. And when we talk about habit formation, we know when it comes to movements, 2 big things need to occur. More external cueing versus internal. So that would be something like, don't feel like you're telling somebody to move through their hips. You want them to maybe hit a wall behind them at a hip hinge. But also, I need to create random practice. So if I do the same drill over and over with no different inputs or no varied movement, it's very hard to create a rock solid habit. I have to get that person to create the same movement or the similar movement in a lot of different scenarios. So recap, look at the volume of your patients. Simple test, gamma motor neuron elbow flexion test. What's that feel like? What's end range look like? Maybe you throw a hypermobility score at them. Muscle contraction is going to be dependent on a lot of this stuff. And then make sure when you're looking at somebody's resting tone or their flexibility that you are addressing these things over here and turning down the volume. Hope you guys learned something. See you next time.